Welcome to another swoon-worthy conversation. I'm Danica Bloom, and this today is a conversation with Dr. Donna Jennings, who is an erotic romance and erotica writer who brings both brains and heat to the page. Dr. J's got a PhD and a passion for science-informed storytelling. She crafts sizzling, emotionally rich tales that are as smart as they are sexy. I can attest to that. Now, whether Dr. J is writing, whether she's editing or coaching authors, she believes in sex-positive narratives that empower, entertain, and arouse. Dr. J, we have known each other now for coming up on 3 years. We've been in
Yes.
together, which is
How
amazing.
exciting.
It is. And how serendipitous that the way we met was because, another community said, "Hey, you two look like you might be sympathetic to each other's, I don't know, services and values." And so that's how we met. And today, the day that we're recording, you are celebrating the 1 year anniversary of a nonfiction book that you published. I just want you to hold it up because
I am. The fiction writer's sexuality guide. Sex, it's more than a scene. 1 year old today.
Congratulations. That is fantastic.
Thanks.
It is such a great book. Now, I want to start with a fun fact. So I heard that you have been in the sexuality world for 49 years. You've told me this, and that you started your career in sexuality packing condoms at Adam.
Mhm. Yes. Oh, it's hard to believe that was the jumping off point for my whole world. I dropped out of college. I found this job. I had no idea what I was doing. I walked in and I went, this is interesting. This was the first place that provided 100% permission about sexuality. We talked about it. There were all the products. Here's, what it has to do with. And the CEO of the company had gotten his master's in public health. And it was of interest to me, like, how could I use this moving forward? And he was a philanthropist and he sent condoms to third world countries. So I saw the good of sexuality, ways that you could use it. And it was a jumping off to 3 degrees later from starting with Adam and Eve. But yes, packing condoms was where I got my big start.
I love that these experiences that we have when we're young, you have no idea where that's going to take you. So,
True.
so from dropping out of high school to earning a PhD and then having decades working as a doctor, working in the world as a therapist with sexuality, what drew you away from that to working with romance authors rather than other fields?
Well, if you think about the trajectory of your professional career, I think about all the different things that I had done. And as the professional college professor was closing out, my students were not happy that I was retiring. And they said, you have to keep educating. And I looked at them, what do you mean? So, well, you tell great stories. And I think maybe you should be writing. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And I said, why is this so important to you? And they said, because their first sex education experience was through romance novels. And so at that point in time, I started just reading tons and tons of romance and love the happily ever after aspect, but thought, how could I help embellish this richness of love plus lust in relationship? And how can I use all the expertise that I have in sexuality to help others?
Yeah, I love that. Oh, but first of all, it's so rare that we hear a story where it's the students telling the teacher, you should be writing romance. Fun twist. What a fun twist. And yet that connection that we're not just writing our characters, we're also learning about healthy sexuality for ourselves as authors, but also sharing that with the readers who we're writing for.
Kind of thought it was what better place to consider a happily ever after for my own career than sitting in romance and doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. It gives me shivers because it just makes me so happy. What you do is
Yeah.
so important. So in working with authors, how do you help them balance emotional depth and the sexual chemistry in their stories?
Yeah. Well, I think I start with the fact that most people haven't had formal sexuality education. So I kind of go with blank slates in terms of where people are and trying to explain aspects of sexuality individually, relationally, so it makes sense for how you would put a character together. But in the most simplistic form, I sit it with meaning. We have to have meaning for the activity that we're moving forward to participate in. And whether we're looking at it early on in the relationship, how we're setting the stage for it, it's still based in meaning. So we have to have information that we can use to give the about what sexuality has to do with for the individual character.
You held up the book cover and there's an image of a weaving. And
Mhm.
that's one thing that I appreciate about the way you talk about including sexuality in our stories. As a steamy romance author, I wasn't very smart about the first books that I wrote, the first romance novels I wrote. I was reading romance and trying to emulate the patterns of the sex at 60 and things like that. But the idea that the sexual relationship starts from the first time these characters meet and it's woven
Yeah.
into every interaction was
Yeah.
mind blowing.
And, and with the meaning, I use things like Helen Fisher's personality test. What are the differences related to science? Because that's some of our brain function, how personality is put together. How can we create the characters so they're the right match? You can do this with the testing. And I think that's a way to think about your characters in a different way, their conflicts, their interests, their wants, their desires, and how that's going to come forward, pushing that meaning as the fuel. I mean, that really needs to stay the fuel. If we think about anger, joy, I'm horny, whatever the feeling is, the embodiment of that is the meaning. And that's what it's going to look like in the structure of the sexual scene, close up, on top of you, personal.
So I'm curious if you had a piece of advice that you were going to offer to an author who was nervous about writing an explicit open door sex scene for the first
Mhm.
time. What advice would you give them?
Well, where I would start is to say, find your favorite movie that has the steamiest scene in it that you just always want to go back and watch that particular thing. And take your remote, get ready for stop and start, but write out the dialogue of that scene, leave spaces, then go in and write what are the actions in that scene? What are you seeing moving? So you're layering information in, and then you look at what is the emotion so that you can see the action was different each time for something that was going on. What's driving that train? What is the emotion behind that? And I think when you go back and add those elements, then you can start to see how a scene really works. And one of the things that I do is use the Outlander wedding scene because it has 3 different scenes for clarity about what I'm talking about when I say the emotion drives the train, and it makes every scene of sexuality look different and feel different. And if you stay with that with your character, you will never have a scene with direct up close and personal sex that is the same. And I hear so many people say that's the hardest part for them is how do I make it different? Easy. You stay with the character, what they're feeling, all of these good things about them.
So thinking of this approach in your book, you have a sex history coaching to build a character's erotic blueprint as an exercise, right? What does that look like in practice, and how does the process help authors create those authentic characters?
Well, when I talk about an erotic blueprint, I'm looking at the world that the character has grown up in and the impact of everything on them to the way they actually behave. So, how has what they've experienced impacted their sexuality? So, in therapy, I'll go down my therapy road for a minute. So, if I have a client sitting here talking to me, we're in present time. They're telling me this is the concern that I have between my partner and I. This is what I'm trying to work out. Here's what I've done that helped. Here's what didn't. So, in that moment, I'm in present time. And as a therapist, I'm going backwards. What would have built this result at this moment?
Right.
The cool thing about therapy is that I don't actually have to have them go back in time to do anything because when we figure out what's going on here and they work it in the moment, they've taken care of the past. But as a writer, we need to know what the past is so we can create it. So if we use, like I have lots of worksheets in the book, but it's building the sex history. It's thinking about things like the difference between you being Canadian and me being that lovely Southern, North Carolina woman that I am, we've had very different experiences culturally, school wise, education, and then the people that we've met, how they think about sexuality, how institutions like religion have given us information. All of those things come together to create what our mental, emotional, spiritual, the whole nine yards about sexuality. So you're starting to make the character be really full, and that you're allowing sexuality to be that open part and bringing it forward to the readers.
Every time I talk to you, I'm glad we're recording today, because so often when we talk, I'm not recording, and there are these pieces that I just want to go back and listen to again, because it wants to settle in me what you're saying.
Mhm.
You just kind of referred to or alluded to like the holistic sexuality of your
Mhm.
characters. And there's another worksheet that you have in this book, the scene check for a holistic sexuality assessment. And I want to know, how does doing that exercise benefit writers who want to ensure that their intimate scenes are both hot, steamy, but also healthy? Because we have to be thinking of readers. And I want to ask you a question about readers after this, too.
Okay. Well, to start with, I think it's important to recognize that as writers, we already have a baseline for understanding how important the senses are in everything that we're doing. So, yay, we're already there in that part. But now we want to take it apart and look at how to use the senses in sexuality, and for sexuality to be a tool that we can watch character growth happen. So I talk about using sex well, using a tool well. A lot of people have never been taught where the sexuality part sits. So I help people break apart their character so they can see where the sexuality is, whether how much of this is a mental process, how much of it is a physical process. So we're doing different checks in that direction. But also, we want to look at the environment that they're sitting in, the setting that you're having the character be in, permissions. You're looking at things that give the consent aspect. Where does this fit within this relationship that you're building toward in this happily ever after? And it's pacing. How fast are you moving forward into something? Is the arc of the character making sense for what their growth pieces are? It's layered to take a look at that. And I think when you you think about the tool of sex, then you kind of live it. You start living what sexuality is. And when you can start doing that, then you'll learn how to separate yourself from your character. But if you live in your character's sexuality world, it gives you permission to be doing more things. But it's easy with a checklist to go, is this in my scene? Is this in my story? Is this in what we're doing in that direction? So yeah, that's kind of maybe a backwards way to get around it, but that's what I do.
Well, and I think maybe that makes sense that it's a backwards way, because what you're doing is helping us see the full integration of the sex into the character's whole being, and into the relationship, and into the story and the plot and everything else, so that it's not just
Mhm.
like when we first met, I admitted to you that when I'm writing a draft, I have my square brackets that say insert sex scene here, because I need to be in the right space, but it's not an insert sex scene here. That is not the way we write
No.
the integrated sexuality of our characters, right?
I had a therapist who worked with me who said that sex is a learned skill and an acquired taste. That's no different than learning how to write. It is a learned skill and it is an acquired taste, and nobody does it the same. Sex isn't the same. Writing isn't the same. We're coming from ourselves to put that on paper. So it's as individual as a fingerprint. And that's an important thing to think about. My work helps people tease that out and to recognize that no scene would ever be the same.
Yeah. So what would be a sex ed tip if you're going to be giving a romance writer a sex ed tip? What would it be?
Just one. Nope, it's not going to be just one then. It's going to be so for vulva havers, clitoral stimulation. You must use the clitoral stimulation. Lube is essential and playful. So we have to continue that. And You know yourself so well when you're on the page that you know it's you or your character that you can start doing this. And you need to make an erotic play box for yourself that has all sorts of interesting sexuality tools that you can tap into at any point in time that you understand what they're for and how to use them. And as you learn things, you collect it and put it in this box for yourself.
Love that so much. Like the tickle trunk on Mr. Dress Up for sexuality for romance readers. I don't know if anyone else knows Mr. Dress Up. I think that was a Canadian show, but he had a tickle trunk that he'd bring out, and that's where all the toys would be. Okay, so tell me if there are any, like, the common misconceptions that romance authors might have about writing sex scenes or writing erotic content that you can help them address through coaching.
Well, you know, it's funny because you already prefaced that when you talked about the insert sex here, because I think that sends the message that a scene is discrete. You
Yeah.
know, it is, it's this. I'm going to put it here at this point, and it doesn't lend itself to being a part of the whole story. So when we deal with that holistic, I'm a person, you're a person, our sexuality, and even if you look at things like in my space here, I can turn around and you'll see sexuality things. If I do my wall, you see sexuality things. If you go in my bedroom, you see sexuality things. How do we start to integrate and understand there are little baby nuances that maybe people wouldn't necessarily see, but they're there. So now we're taking the focus to say, I want to see all the little things. I mean, I have a piece of jewelry that has a person dangling on it with a penis sticking out. And half the time when I wear it, people go, that is such a cool necklace. They don't realize what they're looking at. And then I laugh because it's like, yeah, you didn't really pay attention, did you? But for the people who pay attention, they got a different message. It's like, she's wearing an erect penis on her chest.
That's so fun.
I know. And so it's how can we start taking a look at all of this as a holistic component and be able to tease it out for physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual.
Okay, well, that's now led me to another question. So, before I started writing romance, I have a very, but probably like many women, my own sexual history has got some trauma in it. And I grew up in a family where we did not talk about sex. There was no sex ed. I happened to miss it in school because I was in a French immersion program, so we didn't end up getting it. So this was my sex ed. Girls who get themselves in trouble deserve the consequences. That was what I carried with me. And it took me decades, well into my 40s, before I could talk about sex openly. No, I'm lying. It took me into my 50s before I could openly talk about sex. One of my marriages ended because I couldn't openly talk about sex with my own husband. Would it have been possible for me to write steamy romance well before I actually did my own healing and started to come to terms with my own sexuality?
That's a great question. The way I think about it is we're ready to learn when we're ready to learn. And when you start writing, whenever that is, the healing process happens. So maybe if you had been writing earlier, the healing would have happened earlier. Maybe you weren't ready for the healing to happen earlier on. You had to have some more life experience to make the impact of I'm ready at this moment. It is so interesting to me for how people's paths cross, just like you talked about ours. I think the way that we work with sexuality, if somebody's hearing this and it resonates with them, then the time is now. And it doesn't matter about the past. The time is now, and we're going to work with it. And if that includes discussing what their world brought in, which was that particular trauma or the dysfunction or those things, the person is saying, I'm ready to break past that. I'm ready to move through that. If you take a look, I was talking this morning in another presentation about menopause, and that a lot of people are taking a look at the idea that in menopause, you need more psychological, more physical. And when you have that happening, that more may be taking your pen and writing out what a fantasy is for you. And it could be taking that thing out of my play box over here and this vibrator for women only, sit it in your chair and have a seat on it in that process to get everything going. I mean, it's using sex well. How can you use sex well? And that's what I'm selling. How to use sex well.
Right. Well, you just mentioned fantasy, and you also want to balance, I know from all of the work you've done in sexuality education, the scientific accuracy. And
Mhm.
your own bio talks about the fact that you bring brains and heat to storytelling. How can we balance that, the scientific accuracy for folks like me who could have really used a romance novel to teach
Mhm.
me about sexual education with the fantasy elements, because we are reading escapist fiction,
Yeah.
to make it fun, to make romance fun?
My one word answer is creativity. If you think about the fact that chakra number 2 is the creativity chakra and the sexuality chakra, I love talking about those two things merged together. When you can showcase sexuality, and in the book, I have a thing that I call the implicit model: permission, limited information, specific suggestion. So, as you're writing your story about your character and you've started to now pay attention about sexuality, you'll learn new pieces of information. Like, for example, women need clitoral stimulation up into the orgasm in order to have the orgasm. Now, but how are you going to write that? Well, you're going to write that related to what you're going to do. Is it a thumb? Is it a toy? Is it, whatever? And you're putting this information, which is factual,
Yeah.
into your story. It's kind of like putting the medicine that you need to give somebody in sugar, in order for they may not know that it's medicine, but you're working at it from the standpoint that you want to provide a sex positive direction for people to hear about sexuality. You're doing your work to understand that this is accurate information, it is scientific information. And I was going to tell you that one of the things when I thought about this type of thing. So, as a sex educator, sex therapist, I like to put my stories in the setting of sexuality. And I was thinking back to the first published story that I wrote, and the story was called Tested. And it was about two graduate students who were taking a human sexuality class and they were about to have a test. And the female main character decided after they'd been studying that she was going to give a review to the male main character. And she did everything sexuality wise while she asked him questions about the quantum model, about arousal, about desire. And she's mirroring everything to make him get hotter and have each of the things occur. So you can create with creativity
Yeah.
just about anything.
I love that. I have the great honor and treat of often hearing about the stories that you're working on before they're published, and they're inspired. They're so much fun. They're so different from the standard, they are creative. They're fabulously
Oh,
fun.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You mentioned lube. That's a tip. I have to tell you, when I first started reading romance, which was in my 50s, late 40s, early 50s, I used to feel really inadequate because I have always needed lube to enjoy sex. When I read scenes where the woman is dripping her underwear as well, I'm always like, what? Well, that is not my lived experience. It is so far from my lived experience. And it always made me feel a little bit less than, like part of me was broken.
A lot of people don't understand how their body works. And just because lubrication happens doesn't mean that everything's working the way it's supposed to work. You could be taking a medication that is affecting what's happening for vaginal secretion. You could have a higher level of stress today. That can affect it. So there are many things that come into play. And the other aspect about lube that most people never get taught is that our tissue can have little tiny micro tears, and lube keeps that process from happening. And so it isn't just I'm wet from arousal, desire, my body's working the sexual process. There are other ways that make this be an I don't want to say it, like a little appetizer, like a little extra something that you want to have because this is going to make this even better. So
Right.
that's how I try to help people think about it. That's all your tools that you have around you. I want to make sure I feel really good before, during, and after. Lube is going to help me get there, and not thinking about it as a negative aspect. It's just another thing that's going to make life slip sliding away.
That I love that. So, okay, so your background in science, clearly you've just used that to share a little bit about my writing, but also me and my experience with sexuality.
Mhm.
Can you share any other example of how science can make a scene more compelling? Like that whole discussion on lube, I can see how that could be played out to be very sexy using
Yeah.
lube.
Well, it's funny. I'm going to step back on that for a second because when I think about science for me, I mean, it really is a theoretical perspective. It's a process. It's how you look at things. So my background is about holistic nature. How do we make things whole? When it's whole, what are the parts? How do the parts relate to each other? Whether that's our brain, whether that's our bodies, whether that's our relationship. I'm all the time looking and I look around and I see what's going on. So I take a big picture view of what that has to do with. And when I look at my stories, I do the same thing. And I think with the example of tested, to be able to know the science and bring that forward as part of the story at the same time that the sexual response cycle is occurring for the people, you've dovetailed the science, the writing, the pacing, all of the components together. And you look at the situation. I mean, this was two people that were focused on, I have to take a test, and the test is about sexuality, and I'm in a sexuality class. And that's whole in itself. So when you're writing your story, you're thinking about what is the world my character lives in, which is why I like to say, be in the sexuality lane of their world. Have the experience of it as you're going through it. You may need to get information that you want to tie in. My book, Shadows and Silhouettes, the main character there is dealing with the fact that she's had a complete hormone crash in perimenopause. And how does she now get back to where she wants to be as a sexual person? And is this going to happen? So she's doing blood work. She's getting different kinds of testing done. What hormones can be utilized? All of this is threaded throughout the story. And then the neat part in this connection of these two characters is that the male is dealing with his own sexual concern. And they're dancing around each other for how they're going to talk about it. And when they finally do.
We have to wrap this up, but you and I know we could talk for hours because we often.
Yes.
I want to know, what's your favorite steamy scene trope to read or write and why?
Okay. I love to read and write, most definitely write, forced proximity. And the reason is because in my real life, in that sexuality world, I had an event happen where Playboy was coming in to do a um, educational documentary on my office. And they set the director, and I didn't know the director was there. And my boss says, you have to go do this. And I was grumbling, that's not how we usually do this, blah, blah, blah. And I come in and I am having an awful time. And I'm saying, this is terrible. And he says, I'd like to introduce you to the director that you now have to work with for the entire weekend. And I was like, this is not what I had in mind. And I think about what occurred between the two of us in that whole process. Every time I think about how people really come to who they are when they are forced in a situation, I love to see how people get out of what they do.
I had no idea that you had a feature about you in Playboy magazine. What year was that? Do you
Oh
remember?
gosh, that would have been 84?
No.
84? It was a film. It was a documentary. They came in, and the interesting part was that the director had gone to UNC Chapel Hill, so he knew the whole area. It was just, it had nuance like nobody's business. It was a really, and that and stuck with me about personal force proximity and why I love to see it in writing and how people deal with the treatment of it.
Fantastic. Okay. So for folks who are watching and they think they might benefit from your services, and I can tell you for sure that you will benefit from Dr. J's services, what is the best way for them to reach you and what should they expect from working with you?
Okay. The best way to reach me is drjauthor.com/contact-me and just send me a message. And I think I make learning fun.
You do.
Sex is adult play, and writing sex can be adult play too. So come play with me.
100%. I will stand behind that. And so just to wrap up, if you could leave our romance author audience with one key takeaway about writing authentic, empowering, and intimate content, what would it be?
It would be step into your own sexual power for your writing and give your characters the best sex life they can.
I think we have to come back and talk about your tickle box one day.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so, so much. I am really delighted to have you as one of the Swoonworthy service providers because I know firsthand how valuable your work is. So thank you,
Oh,
Dr.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Bye.